Small time mom and pop landlords have a new competitor. Airbnb has made some interesting announcements. They're partnering up with larger apartment buildings, trying to get some of that, I don't know, short term rental money, I guess. Maybe they're getting long term month to month. I'm not sure. But we are bringing on the CEO of Himlane to tell us what is going on with Airbnb and how might the small mom and pop be able to compete with that behemoth. How you doing, Dana?
I'm great. Thanks for having me again during this holiday week.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. I got to tell you, when I look at my business, I never thought Airbnb would be partnering up with bigger landlords and coming after my lunch, if you will. So, what is Airbnb doing? What's going on? It seems kind of fuzzy to me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that Airbnb has had this transformation, right? Because they used to be for the small mom and pop. And even their user experience was like that. So if you said, "Hey, I need to upload, 50 different properties or units to Airbnb, how can I do that quickly?" They'd say, "No, we're an experience company. We're a travel company for individual small mom and pop who want to have travelers come to their place." But of course, Airbnb now has maxed out on that and said we need to go more enterprise. I don't know everything behind it, but I can only assume with cities really locking down on Airbnbs and saying Airbnb is taking away the supply that we have for long-term rentals, right? Affordability is a huge question out there. They're taking away that supply from folks who need a home to live in, increasing obviously rental rates. We've seen rental rates at an all-time high. What they basically said is, how can we still be able to get access to that, get access to those properties, and then be able to rent them out? And so they're working with these larger, more institutional apartment complexes to say, great, we have a solution for you. And I think how they've pitched it here is basically saying, hey, they're going to try to illegally do this, right? They're going to a tenant's going to try to go behind your back when they're traveling for 2 weeks and rent out their unit. That's a loss for you, institutional investor, because you're not going to get any of that money. And it opens you up to some liability, not knowing what's going on. And so now they've basically said, great, we'll do a revenue share. We'll help you safely have your tenants, any long-term tenants, rent out one of their units. And we ourselves will come in, give you as the institutional investor some of the money from the Airbnber who's traveling, and we'll also give a revenue share to your tenants. Now, I do think there's a lot of, and I want to go back and forth with you on this, Michael, but I think there's a lot of value to potentially structuring something like that. And here's one of them. I used to have a landlord who allowed me to do that. I kept my place super clean. This was, 7 or 8 years ago. I would keep my place really clean because I knew I wanted really great Airbnb reviews. And so potentially it's a great way to make sure the place is maintained. However, on the flip side, I do think you have Airbnbers there. It's not their home. They don't treat it that way. They could be loud and playing music, which disrupts neighbors. And so I think there's pros and cons to it. And I kind of fall somewhere in the middle there, that as a small mom and pop, there may be an opportunity for you to offer something like that to your tenants, especially if they don't share walls, to say, hey, you could rent out a room, you rent out a space, but there has to be some restrictions there, because the last thing you want is neighbors complaining about noise violations or liability on your side. So I want to kind of hear from you, and then I'll add some more points in there.
Yeah. So when I think about Airbnb coming to larger apartment buildings, I think it will be a disaster if they're really going after that. Hey, I'm going to Europe for 2 weeks. Let me help you sublet this, and everybody gets a piece. I think that's going to end up a disaster. Where it might be interesting, right? Let's just assume you have an apartment building of 100 units. Let's say you as an owner, you rent out 90%, maybe 95% month to month, Section 8, all that stuff. But maybe you take the top floor and you go, you know what? I'm going to try to arbitrage or Airbnb these myself. And then you go in and you furnish them, and That might be interesting, right? If I was a big landlord or had a big apartment building, there's always probably a couple of units that are just nicer, right? Maybe it's location, maybe it's whatever it is. It might make sense for me to use Airbnb that way. Because again, I'm the owner. I'm not subletting. That might be interesting. Um, but when I think about the other one, I would think about is not the big apartment owners. I actually go to American Homes for Rent,
Yeah.
invitation homes, and I go, man, if I was like, the vice president of the West Coast for invitation homes, and I had an inventory of 1,300 homes or 30,000 or whatever the number is, I would probably look at my Excel spreadsheet and I would have my team tell me what are the five nicest properties. Like, because these guys bought so quickly, they
Yeah.
probably they probably didn't look at all of them, or they haven't looked at them recently. They might have a couple of properties that are like, damn, this should be an Airbnb. And maybe they come in and go, okay, great, let's furnish them. Let's because again, if I'm a firm believer that Airbnb is a profit machine if the location and the property is right. I believe, unfortunately, that Airbnb became the easy button and we have too many novice investors overpaying for poor quality, and it's going to be a disaster for most people. But if you're sitting on a pile of inventory, I own this apartment or I own these 1,000 units, it would probably behoove you to evaluate and take a couple in Airbnb. I'm assuming they're in the right location. So I think it's an interesting thing to look at, but it's not one size fits all. I think that's the big mistake with Airbnb.
Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it is interesting because it comes to that diversification question of how do you diversify, especially as a larger investor, as you get larger, one rental at a time. How do you could potentially look at diversification? You don't want to put all your eggs into one basket. And so that is a good opportunity. I see it for investors now who are in single family and multifamily, where their single family are booming more than their multifamily, but they probably couldn't have predicted that, 4 years ago. The world has changed quite drastically. One question for you though, I guess if you're so I've seen this so much, and the question comes up on Hemlane, so we have forms for it where you are a smaller time landlord and you have suspicion that your tenant is illegally Airbnb in the place. Happens quite often. And, would you, Michael, decide to say, great, maybe I play with, like, work with the tenants to have some sort of situation for that? Or would you just say,
Yeah.
absolutely no, no
I,
Airbnb?
I again, my opinion on this is I live in a world of black and white, especially being a
Yeah.
landlord, and there are no exceptions because once you create a gray area, it becomes a land of gray, and that doesn't do good for me. So no, I would enforce the lease. I would identify their Airbnb or VRBO or Craigslist ad. They would get a notice to perform, and if they didn't, I'd evict them. Black and
Yeah.
white for me.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point because a lot of landlords, when, the news came out of this Airbnb and revenue share, it's like, oh, I need to increase my cash flow. How could I do it? Potentially, this is an opportunity. I think when you actually look at it versus the administration and the risk, it's probably not worth that extra money. You should think about other things such as upgrades to your units that would make them more attractive, and at a higher price point rather than getting into this situation. Because I've seen it with Airbnbers, you get some good ones, but it only takes one bad one to really make the situation negative. And I have quite a bit of experience with it and have some horror stories from it. But it was 95% of the tenants were great, or the travelers were great, and 5% really flipped your mind on it. And so I agree. I think that it's this black and white. I'm saying, is this an Airbnb? I'm going to set it up like an Airbnb, or is this someone's home that they live in?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the last thing I'll say on this, when I saw the note a couple of weeks ago or the article, to me, this screamed Airbnb being desperate. I think they're seeing lower rates, lower fees. They're trying to diversify their income. I think it's a sign of Airbnb stress. But again, I could be wrong. I have no skin in the game. Dana, where can people find you and the amazing trial that you offer?
Yeah, for those of you with long-term rental properties, so tenants who are over 6 months, I should say, come to www.hemlane.com. We do both leasing as well as property management for you. We have software as well as services you can tap into.
Yeah, if you're a mom and pop landlord and you're thinking about getting a platform, do yourself a favor, go get the trial. Dana's been gracious enough to create a PDF in my free course. And if you have my paid course, she created actual videos. The CEO of the company has a series of videos on how to walk through the trial. So, Dana, thank you for that. Have an amazing day.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Mhm.